A pleasure to me all at last, and welcome back to some more TV shows that deserve the spotlight. But you know what? I'd say right about now, why don't we try our hand at another newer film? This might be a little more on the belated aspect, as with some others I've talked about. But what can I say? I'm probably not going to be as timely as most other people will. And that's because I have a lot of work I gotta do. In many ways possible. For this sake though, why don't we go ahead and focus on the film Gran Turismo. Yes, this is in fact a concept that I feel like could have actually been turned into a film at some point. But for them to finally do something like this, wow. I'm glad they put in all the time and effort they needed. Columbia, as we know, which is a Sony-based company, and the same people responsible for creating Ghostbusters, Stuart Little, and Zombieland were able to bring this picture to the big screen. And I feel like they not only did a great job at giving us something that was well worth the source material, for it being a well-known video game series on the PlayStation. I mean, Sony themselves even has their famous PlayStation animation, which showcases their various franchises. Uncharted, The Last of Us, Little Big Planet, and many more. So the thing is that Sony and Columbia really wanted to go out of their way to create a Gran Turismo related film adaptation. For this case here, we have ourselves a picture that takes place primarily in the UK as well as Japan. As we probably know by now, the cast itself is pretty well picked out. You got Orlando Bloom, who for some reason looks like Arthur Fleck from the Joker. I don't know if that was on purpose, but whatever. And then we have ourselves Nadue, I don't know how you pronounce that, as a young adult known by the name of Sean Bark. Oh jeez. Like I said, it's a little bit different than you might realize. For at least an adaptation, they did the best they possibly could. And then you have his father, basically, who's played by Digimon Hunso, who was actually the wizard Shazam in both the Shazam films. As we know, the sequel came out earlier this year. Wasn't great, but they did whatever they could to at least give us something worth watching at the time. And finally, probably the biggest, most important part of the film is the one and only David Harbour. This was actually the role that really reeled me in. I can't help but wonder, how could David Harbour go from the likes of Sheriff Hopper from Stranger Things to a guy who is a mechanic? I mean, the first time he appears on screen is when he's modifying a golden colored Lamborghini, and he's called by Orlando Bloom, who basically plays an executive for Nissan. And as we know, Nissan is actually looking for brand new drivers. And the way that they're able to pull this off is by utilizing a competition to see which Gran Turismo players have the best time and racing stats based on laps that they've made within the game. Of course, as we know, our main protagonist joins on in the competition, despite his family not being as optimistic with him. They're like most other parents with that usual stereotype. Except this is in the UK, not America. Oh, it's even more weird than you realize. But in any case, despite the many problems that he's had, like the fact that he doesn't necessarily go to college, his brother's trying to get him to go out to drinks with friends, despite it being actually illegal in some parts of the country, and not to mention, he stole his father's car. So, think about it for a minute. He was willing to risk it all just because he is obsessed with the Gran Turismo racing series. And well, all of it actually comes down. He basically goes with his father to a job at a rail yard, but then basically leaves on account of the fact that a competition was starting. And he makes it just in the nick of time only to actually become a part of the GT Academy. That's right. The Gran Turismo Nissan Academy were all drivers that had the best times and stats from around the world got to come together in Japan. They were able to race down on the Red Bull circuit, and they were able to use their own Nissan GTR, specially equipped for racing. As time went by, the stats went down, and every player that was last were eliminated. And it's basically a lot like what happens in Big Brother, except here they're racing a bunch of cars around a track. And for every week that someone's gone, tension basically grows. Who is going to be a part of the top 5? A team specially equipped for Nissan. A bunch of Gran Turismo pros now turned into actual athletes. Well, it came down to 5 different drivers, including a bit of a competition, not only with our hero, but with an American rival. So, yeah. This does, in fact, make me dislike America a little bit more than usual. The fact that they were stupid enough to essentially, oh boy. I mean, they were trying their best to exploit weaknesses in a lot of people and strengths in others, trying to make the American part seem like he's better. Oh, but then, of course, there comes the time of which that the real racing begins. Essentially, the same Nissan GTRs are in use. However, a real big shocker comes up. If you thought that the Blue Beetle was rather notorious towards the end where, well, as I've spoken about before, a man dies from a heart attack and his son gets captured by the bad guys. Probably one of the cruelest moments in modern film history that I've ever seen, period. But oh man, wait until you hear this. In Gran Turismo, our driver, our legendary Gran Turismo Pro, ends up going fast on the Nürburgring in Germany. My all-time favorite track in the game. Because it's huge, expansive, has a lot of chicanes and turns, and a lot of difficult points to navigate. But here's the thing though. In one section where the track goes upward and then suddenly becomes level again, acting sort of like a hump that some drivers are known to jump through, well, a massive freak accident occurs unexpectedly. And our poor man is badly injured. I mean, that is impossible to believe. Like, I myself, seeing that on the big screen, a Gran Turismo Pro somehow does not catch the wind good enough to be able to get his car level and instead just flies off of that hump, basically allowing his car to flip out slightly and crash into the sidelines, which actually, believe it or not, causes a bystander to be killed on impact. I mean, that is ridiculously crazy. If anything, this makes that part from Blue Beetle look like absolute fun to watch. I mean, think about it. This is a more realistic turnabout of events, as this movie was based off of a real-life story. So the thing is, a guy actually jumps off that section of the Nürburgring, launches upward into the air, crashes down, kills a bystander, and now has to live with it with the rest of his life. It's unexpected, of course. So, unlike with Blue Beetle, Gran Turismo just catches you off guard thinking that he's going to win the race. But he doesn't. From a freak accident. Even Orlando Bloom himself didn't know that it was going to happen. Oh boy. And as we know by now, David Harbour has that usual flair on him, where he tends to appear bossy, somewhat sinister, and somewhat shrewd. Sort of like a combination of Mr. Krabs and a little bit of Dr. Doofenshmirtz. Where they might seem maniacal, but in the end, he just wants to teach these kids a lesson. Well, after recovery from the hospital, they both head back to the crash site in a Porsche. Harbour lends over the controls and now ends up finishing the race. The race that was never finished from the very start. And well, there's only one way to fix this problem and to resolve the issues that happened with that accident. Challenge the 24-hour Le Mans competition. Yes, you heard me right. The Le Mans competition. For that, they required a specialized Formula One type car. And this type of Nissan car, specifically designed for the Le Mans competition, was actually even more powerful than people would realize. It was a lot different to control. It was a lot easier to be able to steer and handle based on it having better downforce and control as well as stabilization. Well, in this case, the Le Mans competition itself plays out just as you'd think it would. But of course, as the race itself goes within a few laps, it's unfortunate to say, but our driver is still traumatized from the massive wreck that happened back at the Nürburgring. Though, a Kenny G song comes out of nowhere and is played to him via the radio system. I probably ought to mention that that's actually how he calms himself down. And as we know, his real life counterpart, whom also, believe it or not, was a stunt double that played him in the film, actually does listen to Kenny G before every single race. Mostly as a means of helping him calm down and focus on the goal at hand. Being able to win the race, or at least earn himself a podium ranking. And well, in this exact case, what we have here is something rather interesting. Some drivers end up crashing, with one in particular bursting into flames, just as Harbour himself had described, because he himself actually tried to race in the Le Mans, but couldn't even finish it. As time went by though, the hours went down, daylight turned to darkness, and drivers from the team would swap places. Each of them would get a shift of a few hours at a time, so to speak. Periodic pit stops would take place, and so on and so forth, while still maintaining a decent podium ranking. A few other occurrences would take place before finally, the final stretch would occur in the wee hours of the next morning. The 24-hour period is over, and the final lap is set in motion. So, it's on back to the first driver we had from the beginning. He is up against a Lamborghini driver, a rival of his, who actually tries to convince David Harbour's character to just let go of the idea of having Gran Turismo racers go up against pro racers who got through by actual experience, and not from some accurate simulator type thing. Well, it turns out that Kala, who is basically the name of this driver in particular, actually finds out the hard way not to mess with a driver, whether it's Gran Turismo, the game, or from the real life experience in racing. It doesn't matter which one it is. By usage of various skills that he learned from the game, he actually can, in fact, outrace even the best of professionals. And well, that's exactly what happens. He manages to earn third place, scores a champagne bottle and a giant wreath. And with that in mind, this means that Nissan was officially a part of the Le Mans Championship. They got third place overall. The team was glad that they got to be a part of a winners grouping. And Orlando Bloom himself was especially proud at what the drivers themselves accomplished. Overall, this movie had a pretty good cast and a well-detailed story based off of true events. And while pros and cons are up in the air, I find this film to be rather enjoyable for what it is. Some elements in there can take you by surprise, but can still reel you in for the fact that this is a video game adaptation. It's quite fair to say that video game adaptations have actually been getting even better nowadays than they used to be. Especially when you take a look at certain original projects which did use video games as a big part of it, like Ready Player One, which remains to this day as my all-time favorite video game related movie. Not just for its inclusion of various characters from different franchises, but also for the fact that the whole world itself that was built around the basis of the plot was in fact a virtual world. Knowing that virtual reality is a big thing nowadays, while it's still technically under development in some ways, we already have a number of things that we get to enjoy about it. As for Gran Turismo, knowing that Gran Turismo 7 came out last year and is by far the best one that we have in the franchise, it's no secret that we had to have a movie about it at some point. And I sure do hope, to this day, that the franchise itself becomes even bigger. If a Gran Turismo 8 ever comes out, oh boy, I really want to get to know about what else we can possibly get. So, with that in mind, this concludes another piece of, well, movies related to this series. I will continue to have a bunch of these type of bonus episodes, and I'm going to be heading back to the theater at some point to view another new film at some point in time. So make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side if you'd like to see more on the channel.